This is the second and probably only other plantation I'll go to. This one has been reconstructed, I'm told. It's a little pricier. I've got a tour of the house scheduled.
You've arrived.
Thank you. This is the entrance to the Hopsewee Plantation. It was originally owned by Thomas Lynch, who was one of the signers, or would have been one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. His youngest son, Thomas Lynch Jr., actually signed the Declaration. His father was ill and died before he could sign it. Thomas Lynch Sr. had 7 plantations on this river, and he chose to build his main home here. His first wife was a member of another elite family who owned a plantation down the road. They had 3 children before she died in the mid-1700s. So you can already see there are buildings here. Their big thing is they have a tea room. We won't be eating in the tea room. The attic to cellar house tour costs $20. There's also a tea room, as I said, and there is a gift shop on the premises. I'll talk more about the tour towards the end, but first we're going to go to the Rice Museum. This is Georgetown, South Carolina. I'm on my way to the Rice Museum, which is that building there with the clock tower. As you can see, it is quite a congested area. It's right on the wharf, apparently a historic wharf. Now we need to find parking.
20th century. Rice was synonymous with Georgetown County, South Carolina, the site of the renowned Southern rice plantations, and the setting for one of the most colorful chapters in American history. Rice dominated life in the county. In fact, the history of Georgetown until the modern era is the history of its rice culture. The golden era was just prior to the war between the states. Although the rice industry survived this massive upheaval for another 70 years, it never regained its prominent role in society. Still, it is likely that no other area of the United States has ever been this dependent on one crop for such a long period of time. Georgetown County was the ideal location for rice agriculture in the United States because of the abundance of fresh water which is essential for the cultivation of rice. The quantity of water flowing down her 6 rivers, the Waccamaw, the Pedee, the Black, the Sandpit, the North Santee, and the South Santee is so great that the pressure of the high tide backs up the water, covering the floodplains, a situation perfect for the tidal flow method of agriculture.
If you ever come to this area, I recommend that you stop at the Rice Museum first. All the dioramas and pictures I showed you in the last video came from the museum that was up in the tower. The only problem was I felt like we were rushed through it. The rest of the tour covers the 2nd and 3rd floors of the mercantile building, while the 1st floor houses the gift shop. Here's some relatively high-priced oyster shell stuff. Indigo was the second big cash crop for these plantations. It was harvested in the spring, and then a long, complicated process turned it into dye. The chemicals used in that process were fatal, and most of the slaves died within 5 to 7 years. The entire third floor held the ship that had been pulled up from the harbor in one piece. The roof of the building had been taken off and had been dropped down into it. And then there were post-Civil War success stories. This is Joseph Rainey. He was a South Carolina senator and later was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. At the end of the tour, I felt I'd really learned something, and it was pretty well balanced. I didn't feel that way at all about this tour. Although Thomas Lynch Sr. picked this site, and you can see why. It's absolutely gorgeous. Thomas Lynch Jr., who actually signed the Declaration of Independence, never lived here as an adult. He and his wife chose a different plantation. Jr. became ill from having fought the Revolutionary War, and he and his wife set sail to the West Indies, hoping to improve his health. The ship was lost at sea. The 3,000 acres were sold to the Hume family. Among the inventory of the Lynch estate were 11 slaves. It is the Hume family that made a fortune in the rice business. An 1850 census shows that there were 183 slaves. Tour guests assemble in these replicas of slave quarters. Little, if any, conversation on slavery took place on this tour. Rather, we learned a lot about the tour guide herself. She was a former Marine, a 5-star reviewed guide, who was not going to talk about the furniture, but more interesting tidbits, like this candle molding that lines the fireplaces and the ceilings in all the rooms. All hand-carved. Couldn't have been that hard, though, because they had a whole bunch of people working on it. No big deal. Let's move on. The rooms are filled with things, but many of them are reproductions like this. One of the stories she delighted in was of besting a guest one day who claimed that her grandmother had a similar set of dishes that were in the dining room. And when she turned the dish over to show that it was both dishwasher and microwave safe, it shut that woman up for the rest of the tour. Then she called our attention to the fireplace, which we wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't, asserting that she didn't think historic monuments should be removed just because it might offend some people. Ironic, since almost everything about slavery had been removed, especially since the Confederates and the slave owners themselves had been treated so poorly after the war. Because rice had been the only crop on this plantation, after the Civil War, without the slaves to work it, it was never worked as a rice plantation again. It was, however, used as a backdrop for many, many weddings. Over the years, the house fell into disrepair. In 1970, the Maynards traded a home they had in nearby Georgetown for what was left of the mansion and about 40 acres of ground. It was the Maynards who restored the house and opened it to tours. After a 30-year run, the house was sold to the current owners who still live there and leave it open for tours. The Maynards, as the guide said, were shamefully reduced now to mowing the grass and leading tours on occasion. I wondered how the Maynards would feel being described thusly. And I don't know what it was like then, but I do know now that this has been reduced to a tourist trap. On the other hand, lifting yourself up by putting others down is certainly the genuine experience of a plantation, and you'll get plenty of that on this tour. That was about the only thing authentic at this place.